Hello there, and welcome to What's the Point? A question we should all be asking ourselves, and the podcast by brand architect Bill Ellis that will help you discover, clarify, and live your purpose.
Hello, everybody. Bill Ellis, your host for What's the Point? And today's guest is one I am so excited to have. I have followed this gentleman for years, and to be able to speak with him and have him share his knowledge with you is a treat for me, and I guarantee it'll be a treat for you. My guest today is Dan Rockwell, the leadership freak. Hello, Dan.
Hello, Bill, and thank you for having me. It has been a while. I know Bob Berg from the Go Giver fame connected us way back, and it's a pleasure to be doing this with you today.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate your time, and I know that your insights and experience are going to help me and certainly all of the listeners. So for those of you that aren't familiar with Dan, he is a highly acknowledged person in the field of leadership. He has been recognized by Inc. magazine, by the American Marketing Association. He has a daily blog called The Leadership Freak, which is, if you don't subscribe, I urge you to. And again, all information will be in show notes. But he is a prolific writer in that regard, a terrific thinker on the topic of leadership. He does speaking, keynote speaking. And most recently, he has taken his prolific writing skills into the world of writing a parable, a book that is just fabulous. It's called The Vagrant. So that's a brief overview, Dan, of you. And let me start with this, because it's been something that people often ask me about when I mention you. Give me the audience, please, what's the meaning behind leadership freak?
Well, I wish I had a great story about that one, Bill. It's been around for now 12 years. It changed our lives. I had no idea what I was doing. I'm not so sure I know what I'm doing now, but I do know a little more. But I was thinking about and really concerned about making a difference in the world, and I thought I could do more than I was doing. I worked at a Penn State affiliate in town, and as a workforce development consultant, and I just felt like I could do a little more. So I was doodling around with the idea of trying to write, never done it before, but made a commitment to myself to write 5 days a week for a year and see if it would get traction. And honestly, Bill, I had no idea what that meant. I had written contracts and papers for school, but as far as like writing, so other people could read it and try to, use that medium, I had never done that. And so I did, and it did get traction, and it has changed our lives, and it was all just a fluke. And the name is that way too. I was just thinking about what are other words for being passionate, and I want to write about leadership and sports freaks and, fanatics. And I'm in Pennsylvania, the Philly fanatic is with the Phillies. And anyway, it's been a journey, and I'm thankful for it. And I wish I could say the lightning came down out of heaven, and, I heard a voice say, leadership freak, but I didn't.
Well, it's really amazing how many things. It's a great story, and I'm going to come right back to that. But it's just amazing to me how many things end up catching on just completely organically. People think that there's some brilliant science behind naming, and there's certainly thought that goes into it. But sometimes the most prolific names, the most prolific brand names, are just come from being open to seeing where it takes us. So two things. I'm going to stick on the leadership freak just for a minute, because I hear things like, is leadership freaky? and do you have to be a freak to be a leader? And so very simply, just so that everyone understands, my take on what you mean by that is that you are just freakish on leadership. As you said, you're passionate, you are driven, you are curious, and you see the importance of leadership, and that's where you've gone.
That's true. And actually, like with branding, and I know this is part of what your business is, It was recommended to me, or actually, I heard someone talking about this, and they recommend using your name, instead of when you're getting online and you're doing this stuff, so you can get name recognition. So I probably, if I would have listened, I would have, if I would have known, I would have just done the, Dan Rockwell. But freakish, just I thought I was great at leadership, and got my MBA late in life, and all of a sudden realized I really sucked at it. And, so that got me in, I got interested in that kind of stuff. And so that's where it's easy for me to think about. I like to, and nobody tells me to do it. I just like to do it.
That's terrific, and I'm very happy that you brought up the fact that it doesn't have to be an individual's name, because sometimes that's a much harder quote unquote brand to build online. Something as unique as Leadership Freak is memorable, and you certainly fill the bill on that. But let me get back to what you said, that you had made a commitment to yourself to write 5 days a week for a year, and you had no idea what that entailed. And the one thing I know for a fact that it entailed was dedication and commitment. How many times did you sit back and question your decision to do that and say, am I going to honor my own commitment?
Yes. I think there are, for all of us, a few times where when something isn't working out like you hoped, or it's harder than you expected, you think about throwing the towel in. Most of the time, I'm not smart enough to even do that. Once you decide you're going to do it, then you do it. That takes me back to the farm boy days, where you didn't get to decide if you were going to do the chores. I was brought up in a dairy farm in central Maine. And so when you get up in the morning, it wasn't like, am I going to do my chores today or not? Nobody even thought about it. You just went out and did your business. And so I'm sort of like an ox that way. It's like you just sort of, get in the harness and take the next step. Sure, there are days when it's not as exciting as other days. But about 3 months in, I was obviously obsessed about how many people are reading, and how many people are subscribing especially when you're beginning. And I started watching, and 3 months in, there were subscribers from several countries, different countries in the world. I got my first book from a publisher, a Harvard Business Review book. They sent it to me, and I had no idea that was going to happen. A year and a half in, we received a first invitation to go speak somewhere. I had no idea. I was still working at the college. I came home. I said, hey, we can make money doing this. It's like, I didn't know what content marketing was. So sure, I think there are times when you do it, but purpose is big for you, and I think there was this ache in me. All right, let me just tell you something I don't often tell people, because I was asked early on, why are you doing what you're doing, and all of that, and I gave an honest answer, and someone came up to me after a presentation and said, that's not really the best answer. But it's still the truth. And that is, I started writing because I was afraid I wouldn't matter, or that I wouldn't matter as much as I could. And I thought, well, maybe this is a channel to do it. And so there was a fear component of, and so I often will just say, I wanted to make a difference. And that's the positive way to say that. But originally, it's like I went through a time of self-reflection. I had one of my many midlife crises, and I evaluated my life and said, maybe there's more in you. And that's what we do, and that's good. That's healthy. We ought to have a lot of those times in our lives. And so there was a sense of dissatisfaction, angst about life, and trying to make a difference, make a contribution. And so it's always pulled me forward. And then I started getting affirmation, and I'm like a little child, just, pat me on the head and tell me I'm doing a good job, and I'll go do it again,
I think a lot of us are like that. And contrary to the person that mentioned to you after your answer that question at your talk, I think what you just gave is a brilliant answer. I think acknowledging that we sometimes have self-doubt and we sometimes question ourselves is to me a brilliant motivation because like you said, purpose is the reason I do this podcast. I want to help people clarify, define, discover, evolve their purpose by listening to people. And what you just said is a brilliant lesson for people, which is sometimes we do act out of fear of not being enough, fear of not accomplishing what we want to. And I think that's a brilliant answer. And thank you for sharing that. You said you don't share it often, but I think that, folks, I hope you stay to the end, but that's almost worth the price of admission.
Thanks for saying that.
So again, the whole thought for me of purpose is what you're talking about and what you're doing, Dan, and it's shifting from, to me, a focus on success in the traditional way of thinking about that to significance. And how do I matter? How can I matter more? You talked about starting to get some followers. If I'm not mistaken, you're closing in slowly but surely on 500,000 subscribers to the Leadership Freak blog. At 450 plus thousand anyway. How does that feel?
It's scary. That includes 2 or 3 channels and platforms. So that number is a combined number. But there are readers in every country on the globe. Not a lot in Antarctica, but every now and then you get somebody from Antarctica. So it's wonderful. I'm thankful for it. I wish people ask me, how do you build a platform? How do you build a platform, Dan? Don't ask me. And I honestly believe if I started today, what happened to Leadership Freak 12 years ago probably wouldn't happen. And maybe I'm being skeptical or pessimistic, but I stepped into it at a reasonably good time. I wrote in a way that aligned with what I wanted to read. There were people in the world who wanted that same kind of thing. I didn't try to be, I wrote for myself. And so, for example, I have a short attention span. So where'd 300 words come from? I didn't do scientific research. I just figured that's about what I got in me. If I go to an article somewhere, I got about a page and a half or so. The headings and the way it looks on the page is designed to help readers, because when I go to a web page, I don't read it. I scan it. And to decide if I'm interested. So I thought I'm going to make it as easy as possible for people to look, scan, and say, that's interesting to me, or it's not. I'm not trying to get you to click on a bunch of things. It takes you 90 seconds to read Leadership Freak about. And if you think it's useful, then I'm winning and you're winning. And if you don't, if you can realize it quickly, and you can go do search for something else, then that's good too. Because I don't need to waste your time, and I don't need to waste my time either.
Well, again, what you've just said is whether you stumbled upon it or not, you discovered, you cracked the code for how to build a blog at the time. However it came about, and that is true across so many different bloggers, where make it short, make it something that people can find quickly if they're interested in. And also, here's what I find very intriguing about your work, Dan, is if I scan it on day 3 and say, yeah, that hasn't caught my attention, I'm still able to go back on day 4. It's not something that has me reject you entirely, like it would if it were 1,000 words or 2,000 words or something. So you crack the code whether you knew what you're doing or not, and that's another example of why I do this podcast, because I want other people to just say, follow what you think is best. take insight, learn, but be true to yourself. And the content that you create, how is it coming up with content on a daily basis? How much of a challenge is that?
Well, in some ways, to make it cogent is a challenge. I have no problem with ideas. I have a file with literally, I don't know, 1,500 potential blog post ideas and first paragraphs and sentences. And I keep putting stuff in there. And actually, I don't think I've ever gone back there to use it. I talk with leaders practically every day. Those conversations are invigorating to me. It makes me think about leadership. Sometimes my coaching clients will see themselves a little bit in a blog post because they were inspiration for it. But people are curious about where does it come from and how do you put so much out? And I think there's an unalterable law of energy in the universe, and that is you have to pour in if you want to pour out. And so I'm reading books, I'm having these conversations, I'm listening to audiobooks, I'm talking to people like you. And today's post is really the result of a conversation I had yesterday with a leader I work with who is their national organization, and they're building locations all over the country. And he's starting to do site visits. So, he's going to have visits with a manager, a general manager, and associate general managers, and that kind of stuff. And he's thinking about, how do I maximize this time? Because you know how it is when the big boss shows up, it's a dog and pony show. And he doesn't want to do that. And I started writing about on-site visits. And I thought, you know what? I'm not sure how much of my audience is that at that level. I think I write pretty much mid to upper level, but that's the bulk of the folks that I think read are high level leaders, but they're not at the level of going to offsites all the time. The organization doesn't do it. So I shifted it to, what does it mean to have an effective one-on-one? I know everybody's doing the one-on-one, but some of the concepts I actually emailed my friend and client this morning and said, I just wanted you to know you were inspiration. I posted it. I put it under the one-on-one thing, but I really was thinking about just leadership conversations and interactions. And I sent him a few pointers. He sent me an email back. He said, I'm just heading to Dallas right now. I'm going to do an on-site, so thanks. And he'd been thinking about it too. That's the energy. I'm pouring in. And then I just pour out a little bit of that. It's now occasionally you get dry, everybody does, but for the most part, you got to pour in so you can pour out.
Again, it's such a simple yet brilliant concept. And what that does is present us with an ideal unscripted segue, because what you just talked about made me think of what our mutual friend John David Mann, co-author of the Go-Giver series, the Fear series of thrillers that's out now, and a prolific, successful international best-selling author, what he says is very similar to what you just said. And it builds on that. And what he says is, if you want to be a great writer, start by being a great reader. And what he said is, read good authors, read good content, read and learn good things that will inspire you. So what you just said is take it in so that you can give it out. That's exactly what John's concept is.
Yes, and thanks for bringing up John. He's the co-author of The Vagrant. And I had this story in my head for about 10 years, and I tried to write it a few times, and it was just crappy. It was terrible. And one day I was getting more serious about getting a book out. People asked me, why don't you have a book out, Dan? Just collect up your best blogs and put them into a book. I didn't really want to do that. So anyway, I through Bob Berg, contacted John and told him the story. He loved it. On the first call, he said, let's do this. And, a couple years later and 8 editions later, it's arriving in September. So that's exciting.
Well, it is exciting, and I love the story of how you used a connection to make a connection to have one of your I'm not sure if you'd call it a dream, but one of your inner drives to come to reality. And so that was the perfect segue. I talked about, getting John David Mann in writing because I do want to talk a little bit about the book, The Vagrant. I feel very honored and very blessed to have gotten an advance copy of this story, The Vagrant. And it is powerful. It is so on target and so unique in the story that it conveys. Share more with us, Dan, about The Vagrant and Bob and whatever you want, wherever you want to take us in that story, because I don't want to reveal anything too soon.
Well, thanks again for bringing it up. And the story, The Vagrant, the word vagrant means it's a bird that's been blown off its migratory course. In my experience, and I think the experience of many leaders, is that we can lose ourselves. We cannot realize that we're shooting ourselves in the foot. And so the main character in the story is this highly talented, up-and-coming leader who is engaging in self-destructive, self-defeating behaviors, but he doesn't know it. He thinks he's all that. And, it's the story of his collision with reality in several different ways, with a little twist at the end, which I was excited about. And he, I think, I'll tell you, I generally don't write narrative style. I generally write, here are 5 ways to do this and 4 ways to do that, and, that kind of stuff. But this story, I think, leads the reader into this core concept of structured self-reflection, which protects us from self-defeating behaviors. So when you read the story, you come to the point of realizing, how he was engaging in these self-defeating behaviors. You come to the end, it's got 5, structured self-reflection exercises to kind of kick this off. And I'm really excited about that. I'll tell you why. When I ask, especially young leaders, but when I ask leaders who, engage in coaching with me, I'll ask them at some point, talk to me about your self-reflection practice. And they look at me like a cow looks at a new gate. It's like, they don't have time for this stuff. And so that's what the book is about, his journey. And hopefully, some of our early readers during the editing process said to me, Dan, I wondered if I was the main character, because we all do it.
Well, yeah, the premise of the book and the way you just described it in so many ways is, again, fabulous. So I love the first phrase I heard you say just now, and that's, he had a collision with reality. That evokes so much inside of me, a collision with reality, because what you said was he was doing all this thing thinking he was all that, and then he had a collision with reality. It's a great phrase.
Yeah, how many of us have not, if you haven't had one of those, you haven't been alive, right? You haven't been doing much because listen, you didn't get up this morning thinking, I want to act like an idiot. You didn't get up this, morning thinking, I want to, offend people. Well, maybe some of our politicians do, but that's a difference. Yeah. I'm not going there. But, and so you don't realize, and boy, I just think if when I was in my 20s, if I would have just taken out a notepad and started jotting down what happened during the day and how frequently is that happening? And you know what I mean? And what did I do to contribute to that? I would have saved so much.
Which leads me to the other phrase I made a note of from what you mentioned a second ago, and that is structured self-reflection.
Yes.
Proactive, structured, planned self-reflection, and that is somewhere between art and science. But it takes a lot of courage.
Yeah, great point, and I'm glad you noticed it because I'm not really talking about sitting under a tree, contemplating the meaning of life, and kind of whatever. I'm really thinking about this from a developmental, becoming your best self point of view. So when I get leaders to dip their toe into this, because they start to think, it's going to be a long time, it's going to take a long time every day, and all of this, I say, look, write down 3 to 5 questions you would like to ask yourself. Those questions should reflect your values, your aspirations, your goals for your organization. Write down 5 questions, and at the end of the day, just write a sentence or two of answering each of those questions. Then, as time goes by, perhaps those questions become mundane, so shift your questions. So there is such a thing as free writing, right? You just sit down with a pen and paper and you just start, get stuff off your chest. And I don't mean to belittle that idea. I think that's useful. But leaders, they're kind of no-nonsense people, and they have to sort of be carefully brought into the bringing their best self and the humanity of what it means to lead, because everybody's about techniques and strategies and things like that.
Another point that builds on what you just said, I think, let me know your thoughts, Dan, is to do that on a consistent basis as we grow, both chronologically, but also in our experience and in our leadership, whatever role that might take, be it business or be it the community or be it in a not-for-profit, whatever, we grow and we evolve. So those questions are kind of a guide on that path of evolution. Do you see that?
I do. You want to choose questions, and that's one of the ways to do structured self-reflection is, to choose questions that, as I mentioned, align with your aspirations, for example. And I think, it's important to include others as well. So when you think about structured self-reflection, you think about setting up something that is consistent and has a goal, not just thinking about whatever comes to mind. So, and the reason there's at least one of the exercises involves others in your own self-reflection practice, because if we're not careful, self-deception sets in. The main character, Bob, in the book, he's deceiving himself. He doesn't do it on purpose, and none of us do. We just do it. And so self-deception becomes an issue too. And I'm excited about, helping, people and learning to see ourselves from multiple angles, to be noticing things more carefully. And what's exciting, to take this out to an organization, is as you learn to notice yourself, you start to notice others. And then you start to notice environments, and you become so much better in leading people.
I've got to say, one of the reasons I believe that The Vagrant has resonated so much with me is that I could be Bob. I could be a variation on the story of the main character. So when you said a collision with reality, my first thought is a collision. You're on the highway, you have a crash, a wreck, a collision, and suddenly you know that it's there. But in reality, in the book, my take on it was Bob had a collision with reality, but it was very slow to evolve, and his awareness built over time, which is very much my story as well. So it wasn't a sudden, flash white light experience of
Right.
it was something happened, and then it took him a while for that self-reflection. Uh, at first, maybe not as structured and intentional. Is that a fair assessment?
Oh, absolutely. And I think there are iterations of this where the light comes on slowly. When I was young, I had people, saying that, I should listen more. Or, they were giving me advice, and I thought they were idiots, of course. And, so it's like as time goes by, you start to realize, I remember one day my adult daughter said to me, I think you like to intimidate people. And it's like, well, that's a collision with reality, because on the inside, I'm a warm, fuzzy teddy bear. On the outside, apparently, I can be pushy, which I have heard on more than one occasion. So, it takes a while.
And no doubt you're wondering, how can so many people be so wrong?
Yeah, exactly. The burden of knowledge is so heavy.
Another phrase you use that I've only heard one other person use, who's a friend of mine, actually a Hall of Fame football player who grew up in Louisiana. And the phrase, now that I know you grew up on a dairy farm, like a cow looking at a new gate. I have loved that phrase since I first heard Jackie say it decades ago, and it just paints this picture in my mind of, I'm like, what is going on here? Total confusion. But the light did come on for Bob, and it took a while. You used the phrase self-deception, a phrase I use, and again, I'm not trying to put myself as the character in the book, but I could, is delusion, self-delusion, where and maybe it's the same as deception. You're more of a wordsmith, I think, than perhaps I am, but self-delusion is a kind of intentionally not acknowledging reality. So it's avoiding that collision. It's kind of like, oh, there's a wreck over there. I better stay over here because it's not going to happen, knowing the full time that you're on a crash course.
Yes. Like I said, Bill, we don't get up in the morning saying, today is my day. I'm going to shoot myself in the foot. We want to do well. We want to succeed. And the problem of self-deception or self-delusion is when we pour energy into activities and behaviors that really don't serve us or the people that we're trying to lead. And you wake up one day and it's like, it takes a while to get there. It's iterative, right? Step by step. And all of a sudden you realize, I don't feel pushy, but I come off as pushy. Mm-hmm. And that's a wonderful moment. And what's exciting about self-reflection to me and self-discovery is this is where growth and development actually begin. So we can't really we can develop skills and techniques and strategies and not really have self-awareness. But to really grow as a person and as a leader, we have to see ourselves. So it's not like just being selfish. We see ourselves, we see where we are, and we see where we want to go, and we start to reflect on, okay, these behaviors aren't really taking me there. And now we have genuine adapting. I'm not just, for example, learning to be a better listener. I'm not like just slapping that onto my life. It's like, no, that takes me where I want to go.
Yeah, and it's very intentional, and as you said, iterative. Great words, great concepts. Part of the self-reflection, as I see it, and it comes through in The Vagrant, is that self-reflection requires, in the context of the book and in the context of what you're talking about, Dan, I believe self-reflection requires honesty. I heard a wonderful phrase a couple of weeks ago that a friend of mine used is, do I have enough humility to be honest? And that, again, things strike me now more than ever where they go, aha, that's a powerful statement. And what it means is, am I willing to sacrifice and decrease my ego enough to see things more in a more realistic way? And that's kind of what Bob went through in the book, don't you think?
I do. It's an earth-shaking moment for some of us to realize we could be wrong and others could be right. We just don't, we just function like I'm making the right decision. And then we realize that we weren't, or I'm doing the right thing. And we realize, well, it was fine that you did what you did, but it didn't really work. So it's not other people's fault. And I love the word humility. It is one of my favorite words that I know little about, but I want to know a lot about. I have to tell you, Bill, maybe you'll get a kick out of this. The first time I really started thinking about writing books, I went out to my wife. This was several years ago. She was on the back deck. It was a beautiful summer day in Pennsylvania. And I walked out on the back deck and I made the announcement, I want to write a book about humility. And she burst into laughter. And she's great. I mean, we've been married since we were kids, almost, and we, love her, and she loves me. It's just the truth. It's like I still need to grow in that area. And by the way, I have been keeping notes on a book on humility, and that is talking about a dream, and that is my dream book to produce. Now I'm working on the next book after The Vagrant, but somewhere, hopefully, there will be a book about humility, probably not titled Humility and How I Achieved It, but, sort of a practical approach to this.
I'm looking up something that I read that I think you're going to really enjoy. Humility is when you get your ego in perspective. Humiliation is when you don't, and the world has to do it for you.
Yes, yeah. I think that's in here. I'm not sure. So.
Oh, is it? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, there you go.
Yeah.
Well, wherever it was from, I certainly made a note, and it's important. So, once again, folks, buy The Vagrant. You'll enjoy it. You'll learn. You'll be entertained, and you'll learn. And what a great combination that is. To be able to be entertained, and that's the beauty of business parables, I find. And I wish I had the gift, the imagination to write one. Maybe I need to connect more with John Mann. But the beauty of a business parable, or a life parable in this case, it's revolved around business, but to me it's more of a life story, is that you can be entertained and learn. So I think your character, Bob, did exactly that. The world had to do it for him, and the world has to do it for a lot of us.
Yes, yes. I love the entertainment that you're mentioning. So there's an Audible version, and John and I read the odd chapter. So I started with chapter 1. He read chapter 2, and on. And I love the story, and so I don't mean that in an arrogant way. It was entertaining to me as I read it, and then when I got to the exercises, which are to me, we want to lead people to that, it was so much more boring to, read down through that stuff. Although I think, I want to do it. I would encourage people to do it. The story itself is entertaining. And then when it draws you in, you start to reflect. And at least that's what I hope happens.
I think you are going to be very pleasantly not surprised, but have your hopes fulfilled, because I believe that's what it does. And presenting what you did in such an entertaining way then opens the door to a lot of us to say, well, maybe there's a reason for self-reflection here, as opposed to here are the 5 things you should do self-reflection on, and out of the cold. That's a little bit more brutal and direct than most of us want to get into. So I believe that will show itself. You just made an interesting comment that threw me back to one of your earlier comments when I talked about your 450,000 plus subscribers, and you said, well, that was a combination of platforms here and there and that. It's the same thing in your book, though. You're going to count how many copies were sold, be it paperback or hardback or Audible or Kindle. So yeah, there are different ways to get the same message across. So it's still 450,000 subscribers, and it's still going to be a best-selling, in my opinion, a best-selling book, The Vagrant, when you add all the formats together, because different people, there are people that want Audible book only. And there are people that, I want the traditional book, and I want to turn the page and I want to feel it. So, but it all adds up to getting that story out, which is the important part.
Yes, I like Audible, by the way. But what happens is I'll get an Audible book, and I like it, and so then I'll have to buy the hard copy, so that I can write the notes easier, and so the authors end up doing better by me.
Yeah, I tend to be the same way, and I tend therefore to be adverse to buying the Audible book, not just because of that, Dan, but also because for me, I will listen to a podcast, Audible books, when I'm doing something like out for a long walk in the park, or while I'm driving, and I've never been told I've got ADHD. Maybe I do, but my mind wanders.
Sure.
And and I want to go hit rewind 30 seconds or so, and so that's another reason I'm better with a traditional book. But that's not true for everyone.
No. I just on that, you might enjoy this. Brene Brown's last book. It's about she defines emotions in it, and I forget the title of it. But when she reads it, what she does is she'll read a paragraph or a few sentences, and then she'll say, Now, this was a really important point, and maybe you drifted off for just a minute. So let me go back and read that again for you.
Brilliant.
Yeah, it is. It's great.
I personally, when I listen to Audible books, I personally find it much more engaging when the author is the one doing the reading. Because it comes across as more genuine. So the fact that I'm looking very much forward, I will get the Audible book of The Vagrant, because it's one that I've got the hard copy already, so I can sneak into the Audible. But I'd be very curious to hear how it works with you and John, alternating chapters and the different perspective that will bring. What a great approach.
Yes. Well, they were concerned about it. John read the Go-Giver series with Bob Berg, and that seemed to work. But, the publishers were a little concerned. They're not fans of having two people read the same story. And just to let you in on something, I'm currently finalizing with the recording studio. I pronounced Barab. His name is Bob Barab. I'm a Maine boy, and I pronounced it Bob Barab. And so they sent back, here are the 10 times, 12 times that you pronounce it different than John. And actually they said, we don't know who's pronouncing it right. And I just said, oh, that's me. And so I have to get back in and re-record a few sentences.
That's very interesting. Well, so that's the kind of thing that I never would have thought about. And obviously you and John didn't either. John's from up in the New England area too, I believe.
Yes, and he winters
but
down
not
south.
Maine.
He's a snowbird, but he's up in New England, and I wish I could tell you because I've never been to his house. But isn't it great these days how we can connect with people, and it's just amazing. So anyway.
Yeah, it is truly engaging. And speaking of engaging, this has been an incredible time spent with you, Dan. I very much am completely, my expectations have been met and exceeded, and I had very high expectations for this conversation. So thank you so much for sharing what you have, and not just what you have, but the way that you share. It's very genuine and it resonates, and it helps me understand even more why your writing is so well received globally.
Yeah, well, thank you for your kind words. I appreciate it. We learn to bring ourselves to the world if we dare, and I suppose as time goes by, you start to dare to do it, and I'm glad it works for some people.
Well, I'm glad as well, and again, you are, at least during this recording, the master of segue, because you've just segued beautifully into what is always, people, regular listeners know, my ending question of my guest, and that is, as you look at your life, look at our conversation, however you want to put it, Dan, what do you want my listeners to take as far as what's the point?
Well, there is a concept that really isn't specifically mentioned in The Vagrant. It's going to be in the next book, and that is the concept of identity-based leadership. We lead out of who we are. That's so ambiguous. That's so fuzzy. I'm not exactly sure what that means, so I want to bring clarity to that. As time has gone by, you learn to trust that you're here for a reason, and in order to fulfill that, you need to be who God made you to be, and you need to bring that to the world. It doesn't have to be for everybody, and it doesn't have to be blogging or writing books, and it might be your family, it might be a team that you work with, but learning to bring yourself to people. And I like the idea of aspirational self, Bill. I'm not excited about, oh, that's just not me. You know what I mean? Like you say, well, you should listen more. And I say, well, that's just not me. No, I think about who I aspire to become, and so that I can make a contribution, whatever that contribution is.
Well, ending on that powerful, insightful, and 100% legitimate statement makes this a pretty good time to close. Dan, again, thank you for your insights, for your time. Everyone, go get the book, The Vagrant, whether you buy it in print copy or Audible, and you'll be able to get the Audible with the character's name pronounced the same way by both John and Dan. It's technology is great when we employ it. Dan, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it, and I'm positive that The Vagrant is going to be as successful as the Leadership Freak blog.
Well, Bill, you're very kind, and it's an honor to be part of what you're doing. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Dan. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much for tuning in. And if you like what you heard, please subscribe so you don't miss an episode. We can promise you'll gain value in every one. Rating and reviewing makes us more discoverable and helps others find out what's the point. And if you'd like to know more about Bill Ellis or contact him, please visit his website, www.brandingpillars.com. See you next time.